Russia is choking, not metaphorically, literally, and the air supply running into Crimea has just been cut. At this hour, the most strategically important peninsula in the Black Sea, the operational heart of Russia's southern war effort, is hanging by a single damaged thread of concrete and steel called the Kerch Bridge. The two railway ferries that were quietly carrying the oil, the ammunition, the rolling stock that the bridge itself can no longer safely take, the Slavyanin and the Avant-Garde, are now on the bottom or out of action. Russia has 0 rail ferries left in the Black Sea. 0. The land corridor through Mariupol, Berdyansk, Melitopol, and Henichesk that Moscow spent 2.5 years building as its fallback artery is being shredded by Ukrainian drones to the point where the Russian occupation governor of Kherson, Vladimir Saldo, signed a decree on the 21st of May restricting freight movement on his own M14 highway. He restricted his own supply line because moving on it had become a death sentence. This is not a story about one bridge. This is not a story about one ferry. This is a story about an entire occupation force, roughly 65,000 Russian troops of the 18th Combined Arms Army and attached formations stationed across occupied Crimea, being slowly, methodically, doctrinally sealed inside a peninsula that can no longer be reliably fed, fueled, or reinforced. The gate has closed, and what you are watching is not random chaos. You are watching a structural failure that was built into Russian strategy. From the very first day, Vladimir Putin decided that one road and rail bridge across a contested strait was acceptable strategic depth for an entire theater of war. I have spent decades studying how armies move, how they are supplied, and how they die when those two things stop matching. And I will tell you now, with the certainty of someone who has commanded forces in this part of the world, the situation in Crimea today is the textbook profile of an isolated salient on the verge of operational collapse. Let me walk you through what this actually means at the strategic level. Pull the lens back to 2014. Pull it back to the moment the Kerch Strait Bridge was even conceived. Russia annexed Crimea, and the very first strategic problem Moscow had to solve was geography. Crimea is a peninsula. The only land connection to the Russian Federation runs through southern Ukraine, through Kherson and Zaporizhia Oblasts, territory that in 2014 was still firmly Ukrainian. So Putin made a decision. He would not solve the problem by negotiating, by stabilizing, or by accepting the limits of his theft. He would solve it with concrete. He would build the longest bridge in Europe across a seismically active strait in a region where freezing winters and shifting ice pressure routinely break engineering assumptions, and he would route the entire logistical destiny of an occupied peninsula across 19 kilometers of exposed structure. That was the first mistake, and it was not tactical. It was psychological. It was the assumption that scale equals safety. The bridge opened in 2018. By 2022, after Putin launched the full-scale invasion, that bridge became the umbilical cord of the entire southern front. Every tank, every artillery shell, every fuel truck, every conscript, and every contract soldier rotated into the Kherson and Zaporizhia axes ran across that bridge or through a land corridor that did not yet exist. And then, in October 2022, Ukraine demonstrated the second mistake in Russian planning. A single truck bomb on the Kerch Bridge, followed by the secondary detonation of an oil train running over it at the same moment, took out an entire span of the road deck and badly compromised the rail section. Let that sink in for a moment. One vehicle, one coordinated moment, and the structural assumption of an entire theater began to crack. What happened next changed the logic of the war. From that point on, Russian engineers quietly downgraded the load-bearing classification of the rail section. Heavy fuel trains, ammunition trains, the bulk military traffic the front was hungry for, those were pulled off the bridge and shifted onto rail ferries. The Slavyanin, the Avant-Garde, a small fleet of vessels making a 9 nautical mile crossing from the port of Kavkaz on the Russian mainland to the Crimean side. Russia, in other words, had already silently admitted that the bridge could no longer do the job it was built for. The fallback was a handful of aging ferries and a hastily reinforced land corridor along the Sea of Azov coast, the road and rail spine that runs through Mariupol, Berdyansk, Melitopol, and Henichesk, the spine that the Russian Ministry of Defense and the propaganda apparatus called the land bridge to Crimea. And here is where mainstream framing misses the entire picture. Western news outlets covered the Kerch Bridge strikes as spectacle. They covered the ferry attacks as raids. They covered the highway interdictions as nuisance. They are not nuisances. They are not raids. They are not spectacle. They are the sequence, methodical components of a campaign that has a single doctrinal objective: convert occupied Crimea from a forward base into an operational island. Walk with me through the milestones because the chronology is the argument. October 2022. Truck bomb on the Kerch Bridge. The road deck partially collapses. The rail span burns. Russia is forced to accept restricted loading on the structure for the rest of the war. Mistake number 1 is now operational fact. Summer 2023. Ukraine begins systematically targeting the Taganrog bridges and the Henichesk crossings that connect the land corridor between mainland Ukraine and the northern entrance to Crimea. Storm Shadow cruise missiles, supplied by the United Kingdom, punch precision holes in road decks that the Russian engineering brigades have to repair under constant threat. Every repair becomes a fresh target. Every fresh target becomes another delay in the flow of supplies. The doctrinal lesson here is one that Western audiences should commit to memory. A road or bridge does not have to be destroyed to be unusable. It only has to become unsafe enough to slow logistics below the rate of consumption. That is interdiction at the operational level, and Ukraine learned it faster than Russia thought possible. July 2023. Another major strike on the Kerch Bridge. Surface drones penetrate the harbor defenses. A roadway span is dropped into the strait. Russia repairs it. But the structural envelope of the bridge is now an open question, even among the Russian engineers who built it. Sustained Storm Shadow and ATACMS strikes on Crimean air defenses, command nodes, naval bases, and ammunition depots. The S-400 networks that were supposed to make Crimea a fortress are degraded so severely that Russia is forced to forward deploy S-500 systems to protect the bridge itself. Think about that for a moment. The most advanced air defense system in the Russian inventory is being used not to project power, not to control the skies over the front, but to babysit a single piece of static infrastructure that Putin should never have made indispensable. And it gets even more serious from here. Ukrainian Special Operations Forces and the SBU conduct a series of underwater operations against the bridge supports themselves. Whether or not those strikes cause catastrophic damage is, frankly, less important than what they proved. The structure can be reached from beneath the waterline. The S-500s on top of the bridge are now defending against a threat vector they were never designed to address. Pull the lens back. The Russian defensive posture around Kerch is now a layered system desperately trying to cover the air, the sea surface, and the underwater approach simultaneously. And Ukraine is probing all three. Then comes April 2026, and this is the moment the gate begins to close in earnest. On the night of April 6, 2026, Ukrainian military intelligence, the HUR, Armaki Garin, strikes the Slavyanin at the port of Kavkaz. The vessel is disabled. Ukrainian intelligence calls it openly the last Russian railway ferry in the Kerch Strait still afloat. Days later, the Avangard is also attacked at sea. The result is unambiguous and confirmed by Western maritime analysts. Russia has no rail ferries left in service on the Black Sea. Not fewer. Not degraded. None. The bulk logistics workaround that Russia had been quietly using to compensate for the weakened Kerch Bridge has been amputated. And because the bridge itself can no longer safely carry the heaviest classes of fuel and munitions trains, Russia is now in a position where it has neither the ferry option nor the full bridge option. It has a damaged bridge running below capacity, and that is the entire bulk rail link to a peninsula garrisoned by 65,000 troops, fed by hundreds of thousands of tons of monthly logistics, and dependent on rail to move armor, artillery shells, ballistic missiles, S-300 and S-400 reloads, fuel for the Black Sea Fleet remnants, fuel for the air defense radars, fuel for the generators that keep occupied Sevastopol functional. This is not redundancy failure. This is single point of failure exposure. And it was always going to happen. The real question is, why did Moscow allow it to happen? And the answer is the deepest doctrinal failure of the entire Russian campaign. Russian operational planning has, since Soviet days, prized mass and centralization over distribution and resilience. The Kerch Bridge was not built as one option among many. It was built as the option. It was treated as untouchable not because it was defensible, but because Russian planners could not psychologically accept that a smaller, less wealthy adversary could reach it. That assumption was a category error, and every Ukrainian strike since October 2022 has been the slow, public unmasking of that category error. Now let me walk you through what this actually means for the 65,000 troops sitting in Crimea right now. The 18th Combined Arms Army was formed in June 2023, based in occupied Crimea as part of what Russia calls the Southern Military District. It was stood up specifically to garrison the peninsula and to provide a strategic reserve for the Kherson Axis. Attached to that army are coastal defense brigades, naval infantry remnants, air defense regiments protecting the Sevastopol bastion, fixed-wing and rotary-wing aviation elements at Saki, Belbek, and Dzhankoy, and an extensive network of logistics, signals, and electronic warfare formations. Conservative open-source estimates put the total Russian military and paramilitary footprint in occupied Crimea at 60 to 70,000 personnel. 65,000 is a defensible centerline figure. These are not all frontline maneuver troops. Many are static garrison, air defense, naval, and logistics personnel, but all of them eat. All of them require fuel. All of their weapons require ammunition that has to be replenished. And every single round, every liter of diesel, every spare engine block, every replacement radar component now has to come across a damaged bridge that Russia itself has classified as unsuitable for heavy munitions traffic, or across a land corridor that the Russian occupation authorities have just officially restricted because their own trucks are being destroyed on it. That is what isolation looks like. That is what the gate closing looks like. And here's the hidden military variable that mainstream coverage almost never mentions. The land corridor along the Azov coast, the Niinkayakin Krakenchasti, and the Inkari, in Trokenkerpenkelsko, the M14 highway, the rail line running parallel, was never built to carry the entire sustainment of a theater. It was a Soviet-era regional artery. Russian engineers reinforced it in 2022 and 2023, laid new rail sections, hardened bridges, but the throughput is a fraction of what the Kerch Bridge plus ferries used to provide. And now Ukrainian mid-range strike systems, long-range drones with operational ranges between 150 and 400 kilometers, glide bombs, FPV swarms in the near rear, ATACMS in the deeper rear, have turned that corridor into a kill zone. The Institute for the Study of War has documented this in detail in their May 2026 assessments. Ukrainian forces are interdicting Russian ground lines of communication so effectively that Russian commanders are now restricting their own freight movement. The Russian mill blogger community is openly criticizing Saldo's decree because they understand what it signals. The Russian command in Kherson has lost confidence in its ability to move bulk supplies in daylight. Pull the lens back further. Look at what Ukraine is doing in parallel. Yaroslavl, Nizhny Novgorod. The Slavneftyanos refinery struck on the night of May 21st to 22nd. The Lukoil Nizhegorod Neftorg refinery partially shut down on May 20th. The Tuapse refinery, the Novorossiysk oil terminals, the Black Sea fuel infrastructure, all of it under sustained Ukrainian deep strike pressure. This matters enormously, and here is why. The Russian forces in Crimea do not just need fuel. They need fuel that has been refined, transported, and stockpiled. When Ukrainian drones degrade refineries in the European parts of Russia and simultaneously sever the rail and ferry routes that move the refined product south, you create the exact conditions for what military logisticians call a sustainment cascade. Stockpiles in Crimea will be drawn down faster than they can be replaced. Rationing will begin first at the periphery in the Sopta M3 in Skengwar Ash Thingri and Sei Sengri Viri, the smaller air defense sites in the interior of the peninsula, the secondary airfields, the dispersed naval auxiliary stations. Then it will move inward toward Sevastopol and Saki, and then the commanders will face a decision no Russian commander has had to face in this war: which units to keep combat capable and which to put on minimum sustainment. And it gets even more serious from here. Now let me show you the climactic operation that crystallizes the whole pattern. The night of April 6, 2026. The Slavyanin strike at Kavkaz. Ukrainian Main Directorate of Intelligence operators reach a vessel docked at one of the most heavily defended ports on the Russian Black Sea coast. They strike it. They confirm the kill in open communications, deliberately, because the information operation is as important as the kinetic effect. They are telling Moscow and they are telling the world that the last rail ferry in the Kerch Strait is finished. There is no replacement available. Russia cannot simply order another rail ferry from a friendly shipyard. The few yards capable of building such a vessel under sanctions are years away from delivering one. And even if one were built, it would face the same Ukrainian sea drone and missile environment that destroyed its predecessors. The Slavyanin strike was not a raid. It was the operational closure of an option. It was Ukraine reaching out and shutting a door that Russia could not afford to lose. Combine that with the avant-garde strike, with the prior degradation of the bridge, with the M14 interdiction, with the deep strike pressure on refineries, with the Black Sea Fleet pushed out of Sevastopol and effectively cowering at Novorossiysk, with Russian naval boats guarding the Kerch Bridge, themselves being attacked by the Ukrainian Navy at the end of April. And you have what I will describe with the full authority of 40 years of military analysis, the operational encirclement of a peninsula garrison without the firing of a single howitzer in a ground assault. This is a doctrinally new form of warfare. Let me be precise about that. We are not watching a traditional siege. There are no trenches around Crimea. There is no investing army on the isthmus pressing south. What we are watching is something newer and in many ways more revolutionary. We are watching distributed precision interdiction at theater scale. Ukraine is using a layered system: sea drones, aerial drones, long-range strike, special operations, maritime sabotage, electronic warfare, to deny an adversary the ability to sustain a fielded force across a sea barrier. This is the future of warfare for any maritime peninsula, any island chain, any garrison force dependent on a single contested artery. The lessons from Crimea will be studied in every staff college from Newport to Canberra to Taipei, because what Ukraine is demonstrating is that a smaller power, with the right mix of cheap and precise systems, can isolate a much larger power's forward force without ever crossing the line of contact. And the broader lesson here is one that the Kremlin still has not absorbed. Russia treated Crimea as a fortress. It built a bridge. It garrisoned an army. It declared annexation. It assumed that the combination of geography, infrastructure, and political bluster would create a permanent fact. But fortresses are only fortresses if they can be sustained. A fortress that cannot be resupplied is not a fortress. It is a trap. And right now, 65,000 Russian troops are sitting inside that trap, dependent on a bridge that cannot safely carry their heaviest needs, on ferries that no longer exist, on a highway their own command will not let trucks drive on. History will record this moment. It will record that in the spring of 2026, Ukraine did not need to launch a massive ground offensive to begin the strategic recovery of Crimea. It only needed to close the gate. And it closed the gate using ferry strikes, bridge strikes, highway interdiction, and a deep strike campaign that converted the Russian rear from sanctuary into shooting gallery. So pull the lens back one more time. The real question is not whether the Kerch Bridge will fall. The real question is whether it even matters anymore. Because every additional Ukrainian mid-range strike on the M14, every additional drone over the Azov coast, every additional sea drone in the Kerch Strait approaches, every additional refinery shutdown in the Volga Basin tightens the noose another notch. The bridge does not have to be dropped into the strait for Crimea to be lost. It only has to remain insufficient for long enough. And right now it is insufficient. The ferries are gone. The corridor is restricted. The garrison is on a clock that Moscow does not control. This is what doctrinal collapse looks like in slow motion. It does not look like a battlefield rout. It looks like an occupation governor signing a decree against his own freight traffic. It looks like a mill blogger complaining that the decree itself helps the enemy. It looks like a combined arms army in a peninsula whose lifelines are now operated by the timing of Ukrainian drone schedules. The Kremlin will not admit any of this publicly. It cannot. The narrative cost is too high. But behind closed doors in the Russian General Staff, the conversation has already shifted. Bloomberg reported on May 22nd that senior Kremlin officials now believe the war has reached a dead end. That is not a phrase that emerges in a system that believes it is winning. It is the phrase that emerges when a system has begun to see, dimly, that the assumptions it has been operating on for 4 years were always going to fail. And they were always going to fail. Because you cannot anchor an entire theater on a single bridge in a contested strait against an adversary with cheap drones, smart engineers, and a deeper political will than you ever credited them with. So where does this go from here? I will give you my honest forecast as someone who has spent his career analyzing exactly these problems. In the coming weeks and months, expect Ukraine to continue layering its strike campaign. Expect more direct attacks on the Kerch Bridge, both above and below the waterline. Expect deeper interdiction of the M14 and the Azov rail corridor, with particular focus on the bottleneck nodes at Mariupol, Berdyansk, and the approaches to Dzhankoy. Expect a continued strangulation of the refineries that feed the southern front. Expect the Black Sea Fleet to remain operationally irrelevant, hiding in Novorossiysk, while its protected anchorages in Sevastopol are progressively rendered unusable. And expect, at some point, a Russian decision point that no one in Moscow wants to face, whether to begin quietly thinning the Crimea garrison while it still can, or to hold the political fiction of a permanently Russian Crimea while the operational reality decays beneath it. Either choice is a defeat. The first is a visible withdrawal. The second is a slow-motion encirclement. Putin built this trap for himself the day he decided that one bridge was enough. Ukraine has now closed the gate. I will keep watching this with you. The story of how a peninsula garrison of 65,000 troops is sustained or fails to be sustained in the coming weeks is the story of whether Russian power in the Black Sea ends with a negotiated withdrawal or with an operational collapse. I do not yet know which, but I know the trajectory and I know the doctrine. And the doctrine says that a force cut off from its supply does not survive in the field, no matter how many flags it raises or how many decrees its political masters sign. If you want to keep following this campaign at the level of strategic clarity that mainstream coverage refuses to provide, stay with this channel. We are working toward a goal of building a serious, informed audience that understands modern warfare at the level the professionals understand it, not at the level of headlines. Subscribe. Help us reach that goal. The next update is already taking shape because the situation in Crimea is moving faster than the world is acknowledging. The gate has closed. The question now is how long the men inside can last, and that is a question history will answer sooner than the Kremlin wants to admit.